Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you for inviting me. This is a real pleasure for me to discuss my book manuscript. I haven't talked about my dissertation for a while, so it's really nice to jump back into it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the work. I don't have a PowerPoint for this presentation, but I do have a map. Maps are really helpful. Um, so my work actually focuses on the province of Khuzestan in Iran, which is located here. So I specifically look at a city called Abadan, which is right there, as well as a neighboring town called Khorramshahr. And the province is right next to the province of Basra in Iraq. And that plays a really central part in the story that I want to tell, which is about migration between Basra and Khuzestan. There is a lot of literature on the relationship between Iran and Iraq, largely related to the clerical families who traveled back and forth, the political unrest between the two countries. I know we're at an institution that has a very strong Middle East program. I very often, when discussing the Iran-Iraq war with my own students, my students are very surprised to discover that there was a war between Iran and Iraq. This is not commonly known, that there was an 8-year conflict that resulted in the deaths of a lot of people. And that's generally what people know about when we talk about Iran and Iraq. And I was really interested in the kind of social and economic milieu of this area between the 1920s and the period of the war. And my presentation is on why the war happened where it did, and what was the environment of Khuzestan and Basra like for the people living there? What was the lived experience of a border province? How much movement was there? What was the economic relationship like? What was education like? What languages were spoken? So we're going to be going through sort of the nitty-gritty details of this region. I'm going to be making a larger argument about it. And that argument is that although the nation state is emerging during this period, and I'm sure a lot of you have talked a lot about the construction of nationalism and nations in the 20th century. Although this was happening, this border province, like many other border provinces, were not necessarily defined by those policies. And in many ways, they were contravening those policies to create a kind of isolated environment that was incredibly inclusive. It was inclusive to migrants, it was inclusive to different ethnic and religious groups, and that inclusiveness, that diversity really confused the states. They didn't know how to deal with these people and how to categorize them. Now, the talk covers between 1925 and 1975, and a lot happens during that period. I don't want to make it seem as though 1925 is the same as 1975. Lots have changed. And I want to really quickly as I can, talk a little bit about the politics, set the stage for where we are at this time. In 1925, Iran is established as a modern state under the Pahlavi monarchy. The Pahlavi monarchy is founded under Reza Shah. And Reza Shah, very much like his predecessors, but he is going to do this more aggressively, try to figure out who is living where, what they're doing, and he's going to try to limit movement between countries. In 1925, at this point, there is also the emergence of the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq, and they're doing very similar things. King Faisal is has a very similar vision and project for the Iraqi nation. Reza Shah will rule Iran between 1925 and 1941, at which point his son will take over, Mohammad Reza Shah, and he shares a very similar vision. Now, border enforcement will improve during this period. It's not as though it's the same across the board. But the Iranian state, which is in Tehran, way up north in Iran, is not going to have a lot of influence over what's happening in its southwestern frontier. And I want to first begin by talking about the fact that the state did not capably assert itself in Khuzestan and the effects that that had on the population. And the fact that the state in many ways represented a kind of tertiary character in the story of migration, in the way that people migrated and settled. So first I want to say that the Iranian state, very much wanted to draw Iranians back to Iran. And in fact, a very large population of Iranians had left Iran and settled in the Levant, in Mesopotamia, and the Iranian state, in its effort to draw them back, invested money in this project. And this happened before Reza Shah. In 1922, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iran, trying to entice people back, invested a sum of money that these returning migrants could access. And there was a large number of migrants who had settled in the sort of eastern part of Iraq, southwest of Iran. And this area is called Bain al-Nahrain. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience of one very large tribe that tries to return to Iran. In 1929, a man named Hassan, son of Qoli, a Kurd who was the head of his very large tribe, decides to bring himself, his family, his tribe, and all of his livestock to Iran for patriotic reasons. He says that when Reza Shah first became king of Iran, he very much wanted to maintain a relationship with Iran. He's pursued attaining Iranian identification, documents, a passport. He did this for his tribe. And that because of Reza Shah's vision for what Iran would be, he wanted to be part of that. He wanted to join Iran. So he abandons Iraq, he abandons Bain al-Nahrain, and he comes to Iran. Now, this is actually a story that was part of the popular mythology of Iran. In fact, the very first Iranian talkie, like the very first Iranian movie that had voice and people could speak and you could hear them in 1933, was called The Lore Girl. And it's about this kind of story where a couple ends up going to India, and when Reza Shah takes over, they're so excited because Iran is now going to be a modern nation, and they come back to Iran. This is a very similar story, but it's playing out in real life. And I want to talk about what happens to Hassan, son of Qoli. As soon as he arrives to his native town called Poshtaku in Loristan, he discovers that the local leadership there are not terribly interested in giving him a home. They immediately make life very difficult for him. The governor and his nephew try to confiscate his livestock, his money. He has to sell his property to support himself. And he starts a very long correspondence with the Iranian government to try to get the state to intervene on his behalf. Can you please help me? You said that we should come back home and invest in our country. Please help us do that. And the Iranian state tries. They try to reprimand the local leadership. They try to encourage local leaders to allow this Hassan and his tribe to stay. And they fail time and again. In fact, local dynamics mattered a lot in this period. It wasn't just about the nation that was being constructed. In the early 1930s, he writes a letter, interestingly, in Arabic to parts of it were in Arabic to the Iranian government, and of course the language of Iran, the national language of Iran being Persian, and he himself being Kurdish. This demonstrates something that we're going to be talking about later, which is the linguistic diversity that will continue into the 1970s. He writes in Arabic, "I am hopeless, I am hopeless, I am hopeless." He had no avenue for recourse in this, and eventually ends up leaving Iran. Despite the fact that he's a citizen, despite the fact that he has a right to be there, he leaves Iran, goes back to Iraq. At this point, the Iranian government tries to intervene more aggressively, and they say, "We promise if you go back, we'll make sure that nothing happens to you." And it seems that Hassan, son of Qoli, believes this, and so he takes his family, much of the livestock, but not much of his tribe. His tribe decides to stay behind. They don't trust the Iranian government. And again, he confronts the same problems. And in fact, this time he's arrested. He's put in jail. The judge rules to take some of his property. And a sympathetic police officer tells him, Loristan might not be the best place for you. You should go to Khuzestan. Khuzestan might be better. He goes to Khuzestan and finds that indeed it is better. He's able to live there. He isn't harassed constantly. But he's been separated from his family. He has no more money. He has very few options. And so he writes a final letter to Tehran to the Pahlavi monarchy saying, I have to abandon this finally. Please just get me in touch with my wife and my children. I want to go back to Iraq. And this story is not that uncommon. In fact, Hassan son of Gholi in his final letters says, when I go back to Iraq, I'm going to tell everyone about this. I'm going to put it in all of the Iraqi newspapers, and no one will come back to Iran. This effort, this use of newspapers to advocate for the interests of migrants was not uncommon. In 1952, for example, Abbas Tabakoli wrote a letter to Bakhtiyar Emruz in a newspaper in Iran, saying that the Iranian government was not intervening on his behalf, protecting his rights while he lived in Iraq. And the newspaper was advocating for his interests in a way. They were saying that they were by publishing the piece that he wrote, saying that the Iranian government should help Iranians in Iraq. At the same time, the newspaper was also exposing the limitations of Iran's influence. The newspaper, in many ways, was a way for people to gain access to the public and get sympathy, but also a way for the public to recognize the limitations of state influence. Now, I argue that Khuzestan, in a way, despite the fact that it was going through a nationalization process, despite the fact that the Pahlavi monarchy was sending lots of bureaucrats, lots of border surveillance officers, they were establishing modern schools where people would learn Persian. Despite all of this, it was, as historian Sirus Shaykh writes, creating a kind of multi-urban patchwork. Now, when I say urban, one thing I want to mention as we progress is this, aside from just being a site of war, as I mentioned earlier in 1980, this is where the Iran-Iraq War broke out, Abad and Khorramshahr are very important as the most oil-rich area of Iran. It's a place where there was tremendous investment in infrastructure because of this. The population there is primarily Arab, specifically in Abadan and Khorramshahr. Khuzestan itself is not majority Arab, but those towns on the borderland are. And this became a big problem for the Pahlavi monarchy because their nationalism prioritized Persians. And that prioritization also hurt sort of Arab national narratives because much of the Pahlavi monarchy's sort of conception of the Persian self was that the Arabs had kept them behind. And so in many ways, Arabs in this region felt that they had been alienated by Iranian nationalism. The Iranian government, in addition to sending educators to teach Khuzastanis what it meant to be Iranian and what it meant to be part of the Iranian nation, were also sending border surveillance guards. Their primary concern was smuggling. There was a tremendous amount of smuggling between Basra and Khuzestan during this period. In 1946, a commission in Khuzestan sent its evaluation of the border's permeability to the Iranian Congress, and they said, quote, "The smuggling of goods and peoples is not only prevalent at the Khuzestan border, but also between Iran and Iraq and Turkey and the coast of the Persian Gulf and the borders of Baluchistan and Afghanistan, and to end this undesirable state of affairs, measures must be taken." In other words, smuggling was a chronic problem all throughout the region, all throughout the Middle East in general, the borderlands of Iran. In the southwest portion of Iran, the provinces identified Abadan and Khorramshahr as the major hubs of smuggling, but there were many hubs throughout Iran. The major problem for the Iranian government was the smuggling of sugar. Sugar was a big deal. Tobacco. In fact, the province of Kermanshah banned imports from Iraq for a time in order to encourage the domestic cultivation of sugar. And this had some effect. In fact, in June of 1953, officials in Hamadan, a city just north of Tehran, reported that the ban had the desirable effect of encouraging legitimate trade instead of illegitimate trade, being trade that wasn't being taxed, basically. Um, and by 1960, more and more hectares of land were being devoted to cultivating things like sugar. Of course, it wasn't just sugar, it was many things. And still today, Abadan and Khorramshahr are huge hubs of trade. Um, Smuggling was a big issue, and in fact, it prevented the Pahlavi monarchy from developing infrastructure it desperately wanted to develop. The Pahlavi monarchy decided not to build a train in this region in the 1940s, specifically because they were worried it would be used for the purposes of smuggling. In other words, the modernization campaign was stunted as a result of illegitimate trade, smuggling, contraband, and the continued enterprising character of borderland provinces, which they essentially did not accept the restrictions being placed on them, or, frankly, the conceptualization of the border as a space that should prevent movement. During the 1950s, there was a lot of limitations on migration, and in fact, an all-out ban for a time moving between the two countries, and this really did not affect a lot of the provinces there because people depended on smuggled goods. In fact, they supported smugglers, they encouraged smugglers. Officials at the time noted constantly that if it weren't for the native encouragement, these networks would not have continued to be as vibrant as they were. I want to now turn to the social effects of this. I can give you a lot of numbers about the economic effects, and in fact, this took a tremendous toll on taxable goods for Iran. There was a lot of frustration about the fact that Iran was losing money because of smuggling. But I also want to talk about the fact that the borderland developed a kind of social liminality, meaning it was neither here nor there, it was up in the air, it was in between. And states had a really hard time understanding how to place people who did not necessarily fit in either location. Again, this is a story that could be told about a lot of different places in Iran and the Middle East. So a lot of the war memoirs published by women in Iran are by women who are from this region. If you are a woman who experienced the war, you probably weren't deployed in the war. You were living in the province when the war broke out. And so there are lots of really phenomenal memoirs about life in the borderland in the 60s and 70s as a result of these war memoirs. And I want to talk about the most famous. The most famous female war memoir in Iran is by a woman named Zahra Hosseini, and she was a Kurdish woman, and she had been born and raised in the province of Basra. This is in Iraq. And she describes her parents as having moved to Basra essentially because her father was looking for work. And there was a tremendous amount of attraction to Iraq because of the labor market there. In fact, the president of Iraq in the late 1950s used to put out advertisements encouraging Iranians to come to Iraq. And this really frustrated the government of Iran because they wanted to curb this kind of movement. She writes, and this is about her parents, quote, "A few years before their marriage, they emigrated from the Kurdish village of Zainabad to Basra. For this reason, me and 4 of my brothers and sisters were born in Basra." Now, her father moved to Basra at 18 in search of employment. Interestingly, she writes, he did not learn Arabic well. Her mother, who moved there earlier, knew Arabic very well, and she and her siblings were very comfortable living in Iraq and, quote, knew all the etiquettes and laws of the Arabs. She writes, quote, "Life in Basra, a city whose people is Arabic speaking, caused us to learn Arabic well and speak it fluently. Our clothes were also in the style of the Arabs in our area. In our homes and with our fellow immigrant city dwellers, we spoke Kurdish, but in public, they spoke Arabic." She also writes, interestingly, that when she met Iranians who spoke Persian, the language that we most commonly associate with Iran, quote, "In our opinions, the Persian language sounded strange and foreign." The immigrant community in Basra was highly assimilated. There was a tremendous amount of intermarriage, a great deal of trade taking place between these two provinces. So there was a lot of admixture here, both culturally and demographically. Another memoirist who grew up in Khuzestan, specifically in the 60s, writes, quote, because of the border of Awadan and Khorramshahr with Iraq, as well as the continuous relationship with Arab countries on the border, diverse and new thoughts and ideas were injected into the city. And in fact, Khuzestan represented a kind of a space that was very receptive to Arab politics, to Iranian politics, culture. These two things melded in really productive and creative ways, and we'll talk in a moment about how this affected migrant settlement. But in a way, Khuzestan represented a kind of isolated space. The question for the Iranian state was, where do these people belong? A person like Zahra Hosseini actually had an Iranian passport, was technically from Iran despite being born in Iraq, but she was not educated in Iranian institutions or schools. She did not speak Persian. And Iran would have to struggle with this question of what to do with people from Iraq, because in 1969, Iraq would expel a tremendous number of Iranians living in Iraq. So I'll give you guys a little bit more political context. I keep opening this to drink water and I keep forgetting. Iraq has a very tumultuous political history. In 1958, Iraq, Abdul Qaim Qasim ends the Hashemite monarchy, and we have the creation of the Iraqi Republic. In 1968, we have the Iraqi Ba'ath Party revolution. This is when Saddam Hussein comes to power. Saddam Hussein coming to power was a real opportunity for the Iranian government, because the Iranian government had for a long time been unhappy with their border arrangement. So the waterway, if that picture was up, I would point at it, but it's okay. The waterway was divided in a way that was unfavorable to Iran. And Mohammad Reza Shah saw Saddam Hussein's coming to power and the vulnerability of Iraq after revolution as an opportunity to improve Iran's border. For several years, Iran funded Kurdish rebels in Iraq's north, and as retribution, Iraq expelled something like 25,000 Iranians residing in Iraq. Now, the status of these Iranians residing in Iraq was extremely complicated. Many of them had been there for 2 generations. Many of them did not know any, actually we'll talk about the numbers in a minute, did not know any Persian. They had intermarried. These people were not really, a lot of them were not connected to Iran itself. And the Pahlavi monarchy had to figure out whether or not these people would be able to coexist with Iranians within the country. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But a major component of this was actually education. Where were you educated? Education, military. Not drafting, but I can think of the Persian word for it, but I can't. Military, like where you were trained, basically militarily. So in 1969, Saddam Hussein starts to expel these Iranians, so-called Iranians. Just to give you a sense of what Saddam Hussein's estimates were, he believed that 1 in 10 Iraqis were of Iranian origins, which seems like a very high number. Now, we have actually very good documents about these exiles because the Iranian government was very curious about them. So there were several reports written by University of Tehran researchers in the early 1970s to assess where these people were from, what they did, who they were, whether or not they would be able to assimilate into Iran. And it also gives you a sense, their data gives you a sense of just how diverse and inclusive this region was, the borderland was. Although about half of the deportees were born in Iraq, of the individuals deported 1 month of 1971. So there's a lot of data points here. I'm just going to use one set. Many had Iranian passports, making their claim to citizenship absolutely indisputable. The Pahlavi monarchy could not say that these people should not have access to their birthright of Iranian citizenship. Nevertheless, the characteristics that are often associated with nationality, meaning the language, your education, your military service, were absent because of these long periods that they were abroad. Perhaps the most revealing statistic is their Persian fluency. Only about 3 of a sample set of 236 could speak Persian fluently, compared to 62 fluent Arabic speakers and 61 fluent Kurdish speakers. This also suggests that it's likely many of them came from Arabic-speaking provinces. This is also a possibility. In other words, this would capture the fact that there was a lot of movement between Khuzestan and the borderland. Khuzestan and also other Arab-speaking areas. Arabic-speaking, pardon. Now, one of the big questions that the researchers asked was, where were these people educated? And if you were, and again, for those of you who've taken classes on nationalism in the Middle East, education is the center of everything. You really learn what your nation stands for, what your national narrative, what your national values are and ethics are, which were really being created in the late 19th century, early 20th century through schooling. If these people didn't go through Iranian schooling and they showed up when they were in their 20s and 30s, what do you do with these people? Where did they fit? And the answer to that question is they fit in Khuzestan. Despite the fact that Khuzestan did not have a lot of economic opportunities for laborers, an equal number of exiles settled in Khuzestan as in Esfahan. And Esfahan was a much more economically stable urban environment to settle in, and yet slightly more people ended up in Khuzestan than there. The researchers, based on their interviews with the refugees, assessed that the reason so many settled in Khuzestan was because they considered the culture, language, and traditions similar to Iraq. Also, critically, their employment numbers were not so dire. Around 75% of the refugees were employed when they ended up in Khuzestan. Compare this to 80% employment in Esfahan. Not a huge, I mean, it is a difference, but it's not substantial. In many areas where they settled, it was abysmal, the employment rates. Also, many of the people who settled in Khuzestan were able to open up their own businesses, and that is very interesting because in most areas, the government prevented them from doing so due to the fact that a lot of the exiles didn't know anything about Iranian business law. So they didn't know how to properly register their businesses, they didn't know Persian, they couldn't engage with the right people in the government to get those documents they needed to start a business. In Khuzestan, they were able to do so often because of the cooperation of locals and because many of the governmental apparatuses there already function in a way to allow for Arabic, the language that they mostly spoke, to be used in these interactions with both customers and with the state. Even in the 1990s, after the Iran-Iraq War, the province remained a hub for migrants who were searching for a home. One really interesting thing I came across from 1994 was an official who was assessing the demographics of Khorramshahr and Abadan, who said that 2/3 of the population at this point were originally from Iraq, which I consider, again, it's sort of like Saddam Hussein's 1 in 10 are from Iran. But still, it should give us a sense of the fact that this region was incredibly open and welcoming to people who traveled between the two countries, and that the Iranian government couldn't do very much about it. The locals there had set up charitable organizations to help people settle. The locals allowed for these businesses to open, and people were able to operate independently of the government. I want to return to this concept that I had discussed earlier, which was how the states treat these people, because it's very confusing to me. And it's something that I've thought a lot about. And particularly Iraq's response to all this is very confusing to me. Iran's was one of ambivalence and confusion. They really didn't want to get involved in the affairs of Iranians in Iraq, largely because they felt that Iraq had control over Iraq and they didn't want to intervene in the affairs of Iranians abroad. But also, they didn't really know how to deal with the Iranians who returned, because if you're away for several decades and you were never educated through Iran, then what are you? You're sort of in limbo. Iraq had a very interesting vision, both for the Iranians within Iraq and also for the Arabs in Khuzestan. Just really quickly, again, returning to context, Iraq was, no longer, but was a country run by Arab Sunnis. And the majority of the population of Iraq, of course, was Arab Shi'i. One thing to note about Khuzestan is that its majority, the region that I'm talking about, especially Abadan, Ahvaz, and Khorramshahr, were Arab Shi'i. So an elite in Iraq that was already quite uncomfortable with its own Shi'i population, I would assume, as a person who's just observing, would not be so interested in absorbing other Arab Shi'is living in Iran. But they were very interested in doing that. And this sort of interest in Khuzestan emerges really early in the 1960s. It's not a development of the late 1970s when the war is about to go underway. In fact, by the 1960s, you have a lot of Arab intellectuals arguing that Khuzestan from the very beginning should have been in Iraq, and that when national borders were drawn, mistakes were made. A very accomplished historian, Mustafa Abd al-Qadr al-Najjar, wrote of the dismal state of affairs in Arabistan, where he said Arabs were, quote, engulfed in Iranian nationalism. In his opinion, what he called Arabistan, not Khuzestan, Iraqis called Khuzestan either Arabistan or Al-Ahwaz, proved the importance of preventing Persians from taking control over Arab areas. He wrote his master's thesis on the subject in the 1960s, and he argued that the Arabistan experience was extremely similar to other sort of colonial experiences where Arabs had been oppressed, and we'll talk about that thread in a moment. Lots of Arabs in Iraq felt that way. Ali Nemat al-Hulu, who wrote Al-Ahwaz in 1969, argued that Arabs in Iraq were responsible for protecting and liberating Arabs in Khuzestan. He wrote that, quote, Khuzestan is as different from Persia as Germany is from Spain. He said that the Arabs of Khuzestan had the same attire and the same diet and the same history and the same culture as those of Iraq, and they really belonged in Iraq, despite their documentation, despite the fact that they might have Iranian passports. They really fit better in Iraq. He invited readers to not only relate to Arabistanis, Khuzestanis, but also to sympathize with their fellow Arabs and their plight, which he said was similar to Palestinians under control over Israelis. In a chapter titled Psychological Warfare, he lamented, quote, the people today are being subjected to psychological warfare and an economic and health war because Iranian authorities prevent Arabs from demonstrating their Arabism. Arabs, he said, experienced their share of beatings and insults, and Iraq was essentially, he argued, responsible for the Arabs of Khuzestan. Again, we see the same problem that Iran had. Despite this focus on documentation, despite this focus on figuring out who belonged where, that was sort of solidified in the early national period, we have this confusion in the 1960s. Well, these people don't seem to be operating exactly in the confines of what it means to be Iranian, so maybe they really belong in Iraq. It's an effort, essentially, to rectify something they don't understand, which is a kind of inclusive environment, a very diverse and inclusive environment, that did not necessarily perceive itself as either one or the other. The Center for Arab Civilization Publishing House, an arm of the Ba'ath Party, corroborated the findings of Iraqi nationalists in a 1974 volume called The Arabism of Ahwaz, which argued that the Arab border dwellers in Iran supported pan-Arabism. Now, this was a very tenuous claim, and it's something that ultimately was proven untrue in the Iran-Iraq War. It was exactly this kind of thinking that led Saddam Hussein to believe that if he invaded Khuzestan, they would be on Iraq's side, and in fact they were not. This text referred to the Pahlavi monarchy as Persian colonists. They equated the regime's policies to Ottoman and British colonialism. They referred to Persians as rapists, inflicting injustice and oppression. It's interesting also that their demographics, the demographics of Ahvaz and Khorramshahr and Abadan, were constantly being discussed as evidence of the fact that they did not really belong in Iran. It lists, this text, the Arabism of Ahvaz, listed 3 towns that strongly exhibited a commitment to Arabism. And of course, they were the same towns that had the highest level of smuggling. They were the same towns that had an incredibly rich linguistic and ethnic diversity. They were Ahvaz, estimated that 70% was Arab, Muharram, which is Khorramshahr, 80% Arab, and Abadan, 50% Arab. In other words, Iraqi historians and scholars wrote ideological tracts on Khuzestan's national belonging and re-envisioned it as really part or an extension of Basra. That because of their primarily Arab population, because of the movement between the two provinces, because of the linguistic similarity, the same characteristics that refugees themselves identified as the reason they wanted to live in Khuzestan really meant they belonged in Iraq. I believe that the migration between Iran and Iraq, especially between Khuzestan and Basra, offered Khuzestanis the freedom to build their own communities separate from the very aggressive national proselytizing of the Iranian state. At the same time, the state, both Iran and Iraq, observed this inclusivity as an indication that the people did not really belong in their countries, when in fact it was a sort of diverse environment that allowed for a level of difference and a kind of different type of community than necessarily a national community to emerge, sort of patchwork theme or concept that I was referring to earlier. Khuzestanis did not allow for states to delineate where the border should be or exactly where people should live, and in fact protected each other when they crossed the border illegally or where they settled in a place and the state did not want them there. And at the same time, the state, as a result of this separation and isolation, became increasingly confused about what Khuzestan was and where they belonged. And the Khuzestanis were essentially successful in rebuffing state efforts well into the 1970s.